The morning Silas Crow grabbed Mara Ellison's $3 out of her hand and threw them into the mud, right there in front of the whole market, in front of her neighbors, in front of people she'd known her whole life. Nobody said a word. They just watched. And Mara stood there, soaked from the storm, 20 pounds heavier than the woman she used to be, wearing her dead husband's work coat because she couldn't afford her own. And she picked every single coin up out of that mud without flinching. What happened next would take months. It would cost her almost everything. But those $3, they would eventually bring Silas Crow to his knees. If you've ever been laughed at for believing in something nobody else could see, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because you will not want to miss what comes next. The hailstorm came in fast, the way the worst things in life always do, without warning, without mercy, and without the decency to finish quickly. It hit Ash Hollow, Montana, on a Thursday morning in late August, just as the peach harvest was coming in. The sky turned the color of a bruise around 9 o'clock, and by 9:15 the hail was coming down so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown against a tin roof from the inside. People ran for their porches, horses screamed, and out in the orchards on the eastern edge of town, 3 years of careful growing, budding, pruning, worrying, praying over frost warnings in March, was getting beaten into the ground in under 20 minutes. By the time it stopped, the silence felt wrong, too heavy. The kind of quiet that means people are walking through damage they haven't figured out how to put into words yet. Mara Ellison heard about the storm from Ruth Hadley, who came banging on her back door before the mud had even settled. "The Denton orchard is gone," Ruth said, out of breath, one hand pressed flat against Mara's doorframe, like she needed something solid to hold on to. "The Pierces, too. Everybody's saying it's the worst they've seen in 20 years. Mara was already pulling on her boots. She wasn't a farmer. She hadn't been anything in particular for the past 2 years, not since Daniel died of a fever that the town doctor called manageable right up until it wasn't. What she was, in the eyes of Ash Hollow, was a widow. 35 years old, no children, not much money. The kind of woman people felt sorry for at church, and then forgot about on the walk home. What she had was a kitchen, a wood stove that worked when the weather was right, and a set of her grandmother's canning jars she'd carried all the way from Ohio in a flour sack when she was 19 years old. She also had $3, her last $3, which she'd been planning to spend on flour and salt pork, tucked inside the front pocket of her apron. What she did not have was anyone telling her what those $3 were worth doing with. That part she'd have to figure out herself. The Ash Hollow Saturday market ran along the main street every week, rain or otherwise, and the morning after the storm, it was still running. But it looked nothing like it usually did. Half the stalls were empty. The farmers who were there looked like men who'd lost a fight they hadn't wanted to be in. Their faces had that particular hollowed-out look that comes not from tiredness, but from calculating loss in your head on a loop you can't stop. The damaged fruit was everywhere. Wagons and wagons of it. Bruised peaches piled up in crates, split open from impact, leaking juice, covered in the soft brown patches that meant they'd been hit hard enough to start turning. Some of them were still beautiful underneath the damage if you looked. Others were too far gone. But all of them, every last bushel, had been written off. The farmers weren't even trying to sell them. They'd already had that conversation and moved past it. Bruised fruit couldn't be sold at market price. Bruised fruit meant loss. That was just the arithmetic of it, and there was no use arguing with arithmetic. Except that Silas Crow was arguing, or rather, offering, which was a different thing entirely. Silas Crow was the kind of man who dressed well enough that strangers assumed he was important before he opened his mouth, and who dressed just casually enough that the farmers he dealt with didn't feel like he was looking down at them. It was a careful calculation, and he'd been doing it long enough that it came naturally. He moved through the market that morning with the relaxed confidence of a man who already knew how the day was going to end. He was buying up the damaged harvest for almost nothing. 2 cents a bushel, where good peaches would have sold for 15. He made it sound like charity. "I'm taking the loss off your hands. I don't have to do this. I'm doing you a favor." And some of the farmers believed him because they were exhausted and because he was the only one offering anything at all. Mara watched him work his way down the row of stalls. She knew Silas the way everyone in Ash Hollow knew Silas, from a distance that felt safer than it actually was. He controlled the largest produce trading operation in the county, which meant he controlled who got paid, when they got paid, and how much. He wasn't dishonest in any way you could easily prove. He was just the kind of man who always ended up with more than seemed fair, and who had a talent for making that seem like your problem rather than his. She watched him shake hands with old Ben Denton, who looked like he was trying not to cry, and mostly succeeding. 2 cents a bushel for 3 years of work. Ben didn't have a choice, and they both knew it. Mara did the math in her head without meaning to. $3 at 2 cents a bushel meant she could buy 150 bushels of damaged peaches. She almost laughed at herself for even thinking it. She had no business buying peaches. She had no orchard, no workers, no distribution, no storage beyond what her cellar could hold. She had a kitchen and some old jars and the vaguest memory of watching her grandmother do something with summer fruit that smelled like everything good about August. She stood there for a long moment, watching Silas move to the next stall. Then she walked up to the nearest wagon. It belonged to a young farmer named Caleb Pierce, whose father had started that orchard when Caleb was barely old enough to walk, and she said, "What would $3 get me?" Caleb blinked at her. "Ma'am?" $3. "What can I take for $3? He looked at the wagon. He looked at her. He did the math too, and the math told him this woman was buying damaged peaches with her grocery money, which was either brave or foolish or both, and he wasn't sure it mattered which. "More than you can carry," he said honestly. "I'll figure that part out," Mara said. That was when Silas Crow appeared at her elbow. He didn't come from behind her or approach from the side. He just materialized the way powerful men sometimes do, as if the space around them arranges itself to accommodate their arrival. He was smiling, which on Silas looked like a door held open just wide enough to remind you it could close. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "you buying fruit?" "Trying to," she said. "With what purpose, if you don't mind me asking?" She minded. She didn't say so. "Personal use." Silas looked at Caleb Pierce's wagon, then back at Mara. His smile didn't change, but something behind it did. A very slight recalibration, the way a man adjusts his grip when he realizes the thing he's holding might be slippery. "That fruit is spoken for," he said. Caleb Pierce, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. "Well now, Mr. Crow, I haven't signed anything yet." "We had a conversation," Silas said, and the way he said it closed the subject the way a lid closes a box. Mara didn't argue. She was very calm about it, or at least she held herself very still, which is the same thing when you're doing it in public and you can feel people watching. She looked at Silas with the particular expression she'd developed in the 2 years since Daniel died, the one that said, "I have dealt with worse things than you today, and it's not even noon." "Then I'll find someone else," she said. She turned and walked to the next stall. What happened at the next stall is what people in Ash Hollow would talk about for years, not because it was dramatic exactly, but because of what Silas did. He followed her. He went to every stall she approached quietly, without raising his voice, and he made it understood, through implication, through the weight of who he was and what he controlled, that the damaged peaches were his. Not all of them, maybe, but enough. He did it with a smile. He did it like he was doing everyone a favor. And when Mara finally stopped in front of the last stall at the end of the row, belonging to a widow named Hester Crane, who'd lost most of her harvest and looked like she was one more piece of bad news away from sitting down in the mud and not getting back up, Silas Crow reached past Mara, took her $3 right out of her hand before she'd even offered them, and dropped them in the mud. Not threw them, dropped them. Carefully, deliberately, like he was making a point instead of making a scene, like a man who knew exactly how much force to use. "Go home, Mrs. Ellison," he said. "This isn't for you." She looked at the coins in the mud. She looked at Hester Crane, who was staring at the ground. She looked at the people around them, neighbors, people she'd sat next to at every social event for 16 years, and not one of them met her eyes. She crouched down in her good skirt and picked up every coin. She took her time doing it. When she stood back up, Silas was already walking away. He didn't look back. Men like Silas never needed to look back. They assumed the work was done. Hester Crane watched Mara stand up. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than the wind. "He didn't buy mine yet," Hester said. Mara looked at her. "I didn't sign anything," Hester said. Her jaw was set in a way that suggested the decision had cost her something. $3 is $3. You want what I've got left? What Hester had left was 11 crates of heavily damaged peaches and the use of her flatbed cart to get them 2 streets over to Mara's house. They loaded the cart together, the two of them, while people watched and nobody helped and nobody said much of anything. 11 crates of fruit that smelled like the end of summer, bruised and leaking and already fermenting slightly at the edges, going home with a woman who had no plan beyond a memory of her grandmother's hands working over a pot on a hot Ohio afternoon 40 years ago. Mara's cellar was cool and dark and smelled of old wood. She carried the crates down herself, one at a time, stopping between each trip to catch her breath and press her hand flat against the stone wall for a moment. Her back hurt. Her hands were sticky with peach juice. The stairs were steep. She didn't stop. She sorted through them that first night by lamplight, sitting on the cellar floor with her skirt spread around her. Some of the peaches were too far gone, those she set aside, and she'd figure out what to do with them later. But a surprising number, when you cut away the damaged sections, had good fruit underneath. Dense and sweet and still holding the heat of the August sun in some deep part of themselves. Stubborn, still worth something. She worked until past midnight. She had a slight fever which she ignored. The kitchen smelled extraordinary by morning. Not just like fruit, like something older and deeper than that, like the smell of preservation itself, like the decision to take a damaged thing and refuse to let it become waste. Her grandmother's recipe, as best as Mara could reconstruct it, involved cooking the peaches down slowly over low heat, adding cane sugar at a specific ratio, a small amount of lemon, and something else, some spice or combination of spices, that Mara spent 2 days trying to remember and finally arrived at by accident when she knocked her spice shelf and caught 3 jars at once. The result of that accident, stirred into the second test batch on a Tuesday afternoon, produced something that stopped her mid-motion. She stood over the pot for a moment before she tasted it. Then she tasted it. She didn't have an immediate word for it. It wasn't just sweet. It was complicated. It had depth to it, a slight warmth underneath the fruit, and something that lingered on the back of the tongue in a way that made you want to find out what it was. It tasted like something someone's grandmother made, which is to say, it tasted like a memory of something you loved before you had the words to describe it. She stood there for a long time. Then she went next door and knocked on Ruth Hadley's door and handed her a spoon without saying anything. Ruth tasted it. She held the spoon in the air for a moment afterward, not eating, just processing. "Mara," she finally said. "I know," Mara said. "What did you put in this?" "I'm not entirely sure," Mara said honestly. Ruth handed the spoon back. "Make more," she said. "Make as much as you can." The problem with making more was the problem with everything at that moment. It cost money. Jars cost money. Sugar cost money. More fruit, damaged or otherwise, cost money. And Mara had $3 minus whatever she'd spent on the spice that had accidentally changed everything. What she had, it turned out, was slightly less important than who noticed she needed something. The boy appeared on her porch on a Thursday morning with no particular announcement. He was maybe 12, maybe older, small for whatever age he was, wearing clothes that had been repaired so many times, the original fabric was more suggestion than fact. He had the look of a child who had been on his own long enough to be cautious, but not yet long enough to be completely closed. His name, he said, was Eli Turner. He'd been working odd jobs since the storm put the Denton family out of the operation that had been feeding him in exchange for labor. He'd heard, he didn't say from who, but in a town like Ash Hollow, news traveled the way water does, finding every crack, that she might need help with something. Mara looked at him for a moment. "You know anything about canning?" she asked. "No," he said. "You willing to learn?" He thought about it with a seriousness that made her feel like she was being evaluated rather than the other way around. "Depends," he said, "on whether it's worth learning." She went inside and came back with a jar she'd sealed the night before, her third batch, which was the best so far. She handed it to him. He opened it. He tipped the jar, and tasted a small amount off the lip of the glass with the careful practicality of someone who has learned not to eat more than he's sure of. He stood there for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." And that was how Eli Turner became the first person Mara Ellison ever employed, 2 weeks before she had any money to pay him, on the strength of a handshake and a jar of preserve that neither of them yet knew would eventually change both of their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined standing on that porch in September. He was small and he was quick, and he had a particular talent for carrying things without dropping them, which in a kitchen operation where everything was hot and glass and expensive to replace turned out to be exactly the talent you needed most. He also asked questions constantly, good questions, practical questions. And when Mara answered them, she sometimes heard herself figuring out things she hadn't realized she knew. "Why do you wipe the jar rims before you seal them?" he asked one afternoon. "Because if there's anything on the rim, the seal won't hold properly," she said. "How do you know if the seal held?" "Press the center of the lid. If it doesn't flex, it held." He pressed every single lid after that, methodically, working his way down the rows. When he found one that flexed, one bad seal in 40 jars, he brought it to her without being asked. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Good catch," she said. He went back to pressing lids. He was trying not to look pleased with himself and not entirely succeeding. By the end of the third week, they had 47 sealed jars of peach preserve stored in Mara's cellar, lined up on the shelves like soldiers. By the end of the fourth week, they had over 100. Ruth Hadley had told 2 friends, who had told 4 people each, and Mara had sold her first 20 jars, at a price she set herself, which was 3 times what Silas Crow would have charged for ordinary preserves, and used the money to buy more sugar and more jars, and because it seemed necessary, a slightly better wood stove. She also bought Eli a coat. She didn't make an event of it. She just put it on the kitchen chair where he usually sat. And when he came in and saw it, he stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she busied herself with the wood stove until he'd had enough time to be a 12-year-old about it privately. "It fits," he said when he turned around. "Good," she said. The rumor started the way rumors always start in a small town, with someone saying something they probably shouldn't have in a place where someone else could hear it. The word was that the widow Ellison was selling preserves, that they were unusual, that people were coming back for more, that she'd sold out of her first batch faster than she'd expected, which at Ash Hollow prices for quality goods meant more money than a woman in her position was supposed to have. Silas Crow heard the rumors on a Friday. By the following Monday, he'd done his own arithmetic. He stood in front of the warehouse he'd owned for 11 years, doing a calculation in his head that arrived at a conclusion he didn't like. The widow with the mud on her skirt and $3 to her name was not, as it turned out, done. She was, in fact, just getting started. And that specific realization, landing in Silas Crow's chest like something cold, was the moment Ash Hollow, Montana, stopped being a simple story about damaged fruit and became something else entirely. The kind of story where one person decides not to stay down, and the ground shifts under everyone else's feet as a result. Mara Ellison was in her kitchen that same Monday morning, stirring her 6th batch over the wood stove, with a boy in a new coat pressing jar lids behind her, and a cellar full of something that tasted like stubbornness and spice, and the particular sweetness of a thing that survived being ruined. She didn't know yet what Silas was calculating. She knew her back hurt, and the kitchen was too hot, and she was running low on cane sugar, and the jars she'd ordered from the supply house in Billings hadn't arrived yet, and Eli had a cough she was watching carefully. She also knew, in the way you sometimes know things before you have evidence for them, that something had already changed. She could feel it in the way her neighbors nodded at her on the street now, in the way Hester Crane had stopped looking at the ground, in the way Ruth Hadley had said, very quietly, 2 nights ago over a shared cup of coffee at Mara's kitchen table, "I think you might be onto something." Mara had said, "I think we might be," and she'd meant the "we" deliberately. Because a woman who picks her $3 up out of the mud while everyone watches and says nothing, that woman knows something important. She knows that whatever she builds next, she's not building it alone. The peaches were still on the stove. The kitchen still smelled extraordinary. Outside the window, the first real cold of autumn was moving in off the mountains. Mara Ellison kept stirring. Part 2. One woman against an entire system. The supply order from Billings never came. Mara found out on a Wednesday when the freight driver, a weathered man named Odell, who'd been running the same route for 9 years and had never once been late, pulled his wagon to a stop in front of her house and sat there without getting down. "I got a problem," Odell said. She came out to the porch, drying her hands on her apron. "What kind of problem?" He took his hat off, which told her before anything else that this was going to be a conversation she didn't want to have. "The supply house in Billings says your order got rerouted. Says there was a mix-up with the freight manifest." He looked at the hat in his hands. "Mrs. Ellison, I've been running this route since before your husband passed, and I've never had a mix-up with a freight manifest. Not once." She stood there for a moment. The cold was sharper that morning, the kind that gets into your joints and stays. "Who else uses that freight route?" she asked. Odell looked up at her. He had the expression of a man who wants to say something and is weighing the cost of saying it. "Mr. Crow's operation uses it, has a standing agreement with the dispatcher, has for years." She nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming to tell me yourself." "I'm sorry I couldn't bring what you needed." "You brought me exactly what I needed," she said. "I just didn't know I was going to need it." She went back inside. Eli was at the table sorting jars by size, and he looked up when she came in with the particular alertness of a child who has learned to read adult faces as a matter of survival. "What happened?" he said. "Our supply order didn't arrive." She moved to the wood stove and stood with her back to him for a moment, not doing anything, just thinking. Silas Crow happened is what happened. Eli set down the jar he was holding. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we need more jars and we can't get them through the usual route." She turned around. "So we find another route." He looked at her with the slightly exhausted expression he'd been developing lately. 12 years old and already understanding that finding another route was always harder than it sounded. "How?" "I'm going to write some letters," she said. She wrote 6 letters that evening at the kitchen table after supper, with Eli sitting across from her doing the arithmetic on their current inventory versus projected sales because she'd taught him how 2 weeks ago, and he'd turned out to be faster at it than she was. The letters went to supply houses in Cheyenne, in Miles City, in a small town in Wyoming she'd read about in a trade circular that Ruth Hadley had passed along. She was methodical about it: pricing, quantities, lead times, payment terms. She wrote like a woman who had been doing this for years, because in some part of herself she felt like she had, even though the business was barely 2 months old. She sealed the last envelope and looked at the stack. "How long will our current jar supply last?" she asked. Eli ran his finger down the column of figures he'd been working on. 3 weeks if we keep the current production rate. Maybe 4 if we slow down." "We're not slowing down," she said. "Then 3 weeks," he said. She nodded. She picked up the letters and set them by the door to post in the morning. Then she sat back down and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the specific expression of a woman doing math that doesn't quite work no matter which way you run it. "Go to sleep," she told Eli. "You're coughing again." "I'm fine." "You're 12 and you're coughing in November in Montana. Go to sleep." He went, though not without pausing at the door to look back at her with that particular look he had, the one that was still figuring out whether it was safe to rely on someone. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mara," she said, for the 4th time this week. He almost corrected himself, then didn't. "Are we going to be all right?" She looked at him straight. She'd made herself a rule early on about this. She didn't lie to him. The world had already lied to Eli Turner enough. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm working on it." He seemed to find that more reassuring than a promise would have been. He nodded and went upstairs, and she sat alone in her kitchen listening to the wind work its way under the door and thought about Silas Crow and freight manifests and what it meant when a powerful man started paying attention to you. It meant you were doing something right. It also meant the next few months were going to be harder than she'd planned for. She was right on both counts. The letters came back with responses inside of 10 days. Not all of them useful, but 2 of them promising. A supply house in Miles City could fill her jar order within 3 weeks, at a slightly higher cost than Billings, but nothing she couldn't absorb. A woman in Wyoming, who turned out to run a small general mercantile herself, wrote back in handwriting that slanted hard to the right, like she was writing against a wind. I've heard about your preserves from a traveler through here last week. I'd like to discuss carrying your product. Please advise on pricing and minimum quantities. Mara read that letter 3 times. Then she read it to Eli, who was eating his breakfast and pretending his cough had gone away. Someone in Wyoming wants to carry us, he said. Apparently. He put down his spoon. That's far. That's the point, she said. The point? The thing she'd been turning over in her head since the night Odell told her about the freight manifest was that Silas Crow's power operated in a particular geography. He controlled the supply routes, the freight, the local buyers, the market stalls, the informal agreements that held the valley's economy together like a net. He could pull any thread in that net and feel it tighten somewhere else. But the net had edges. The further you got from Ash Hollow, the less his weight meant anything. She needed to reach the edges. She wrote back to the woman in Wyoming. Her name was Agnes Flint, and she ran a place called Flint's Mercantile in a town called Copper Ridge. And they agreed on terms and 2 more letters exchanged over the following 2 weeks. 48 jars to start, at a price that made Mara sit with the number for a long time before she trusted herself to write it down. It was more than she'd been charging locally, considerably more. She thinks city travelers will pay that? Eli asked, looking over her shoulder at the letter. She says they come through on the Denver Road and they want things that feel like home. Mara set the letter down. She says the label matters. Eli frowned. We don't have a label. They did not have a label. What they had was a jar with a piece of paper tied around the neck with kitchen twine, which Mara had been writing on in her own handwriting. Ellison's Peach Preserve, Ash Hollow, Montana, because it was functional and because she hadn't thought past functional yet. We need a label, she said mostly to herself. I can draw, Eli said. She looked at him. I mean, I'm not saying I'm good. He picked up his spoon again, looking at the table. But I can draw things. I used to do it on whatever paper the Dentons had spare. She found him paper that afternoon. She set it on the kitchen table with a pencil and said, Draw me a peach. Not a perfect one. A real one. He looked at the blank paper for a moment with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. And then he drew. She watched over his shoulder as the shape appeared, rough around the edges, slightly lopsided, with the indication of a bruise at one side that he captured in cross-hatched pencil strokes. It looked exactly like the peaches she'd been working with, imperfect and real, and somehow, for that reason, more appealing than any idealized version would have been. That, she said, that's our label. Eli looked at the drawing. It's got a bruise on it. Yes, it does, she said. That's the whole story right there. They named the preserve Storm Gold. Eli came up with it on a Thursday evening while they were sealing the day's batch, and he said it so casually that it took Mara a moment to realize what he'd said. Say that again, she said. Storm Gold. He looked uncertain. Because of the hailstorm. And gold because, I don't know, because the peaches are that color inside when they're good. She stood there with a sealed jar in her hand, looking at the label she'd drawn up in her own handwriting, and felt something click into place. Storm Gold Preserves, she said. It's probably dumb, he said. It's exactly right, she said. The first shipment to Agnes Flint left Ash Hollow in the 3rd week of November, packed in straw in a wooden crate that Eli had reinforced with extra slats so nothing would shift in transit. Mara wrote a note to go with it, handwritten, 2 sentences. These were made in a kitchen in Montana from fruit that survived a storm. I hope they taste like it. She hesitated over whether to include it, then tucked it in under the lid. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark listening to the house settle and thinking about 48 jars of preserve traveling down the Denver Road in a freight wagon, and whether Agnes Flint's customers would find them worth what they were being asked to pay, and whether one woman in Wyoming could make a difference to what she was trying to build, and whether what she was trying to build was actually possible, or whether she was doing the same thing Silas Crow had accused her of doing, standing in the mud pretending the coins were worth picking up. She made herself stop that line of thinking. She was good at stopping it, mostly. You got good at it after a certain amount of loss, or you didn't, and the ones who didn't were the ones you saw sitting on their porches at noon looking at nothing. She got up before dawn and went to start the wood stove. Silas Crow's next move came 2 weeks later, and it was more calculated than the freight manifest, which had been subtle, the kind of interference you could almost mistake for bad luck. This one was not subtle. This one was meant to be seen. He called a meeting. Not formally. He didn't post notices or send written invitations. He simply let it be known, through the particular social machinery of a small town, that he was hosting a gathering at his warehouse on a Saturday evening for the local produce traders, farmers with contracts, and anyone who relied on the freight network for their livelihood, which, in Ash Hollow, was most people. Mara was not invited. That was also meant to be seen. She heard about it from Ruth Hadley, who'd heard about it from her neighbor, who'd heard about it from Ben Denton, who'd been handed what amounted to a summons by one of Silas's men while he was repairing a fence on his property. "What's the meeting about?" Mara asked. Ruth sat down at Mara's kitchen table with the careful movement of a woman bringing bad news. From what Ben said, Silas is calling it a community standards discussion. He's saying there are people in the valley. He didn't name names, apparently, which was somehow worse than naming them, who are conducting business outside the established trade agreements, and that this creates unfair competition for legitimate operators. Mara kept her hands around her coffee cup. Unfair competition. That's what he said. Eli was at the sink. He'd stopped pretending to wash the bowl he was washing about 30 seconds into this conversation. "He's telling them I'm the problem," Mara said. "He's letting them figure that out themselves," Ruth said, which is what Silas does. He never says the thing directly. He just builds the frame and lets everyone else put the picture in. This was accurate. Mara knew it was accurate because she'd watched Silas operate for years, in the peripheral way you watch someone you've decided to keep at a distance. He was careful. He was patient. He built things slowly and then acted like they'd always been there. "What are people saying?" Mara asked. "Honestly," Ruth looked at her for a moment. "Some people are nervous about crossing him. You know how it is? He holds a lot of notes on a lot of farms. People owe him." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "But some people, more than you might think, are watching what you're doing and they're not sure how to say it out loud yet." "Say what out loud?" "That they're glad someone is." Mara sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, took her cup to the sink, and said to Eli, "Finish those jars today. I need to make some calls." She didn't go to the Saturday meeting, obviously, but she did something that, in retrospect, was considerably smarter than attending. She spent that Saturday afternoon visiting every farmer she could reach, not the ones who were already on Silas's side, and not the ones who were purely neutral, but the ones in between. The ones who owed Silas money but remembered what fair pricing had felt like before he'd consolidated his position. The ones who'd watched him buy their damaged harvest for 2 cents a bushel and hadn't been able to argue because there was no one else to argue to. She knocked on doors. She sat in cold kitchens and drank bad coffee and talked to people about what she was doing, not as a pitch, not as a business proposition, but as a conversation. She told them what the preserve was. She told them where she was selling it. She told them about Agnes Flint in Wyoming and the letter with the slanted handwriting. She told them what she'd paid for Hester Crane's 11 crates of damaged peaches, and what the preserve made from those crates had sold for, and what that arithmetic meant for what damaged fruit was actually worth if someone was willing to do the work of transforming it. She didn't ask anyone for anything. Not yet. But she planted something in every cold kitchen she sat in that afternoon. She could feel it. The meeting at Silas's warehouse produced, as far as she could tell, exactly the effect Silas had wanted, which was to make several of the town's more cautious merchants quietly decline to carry her product when she approached them the following week. A dry goods store that had been interested became suddenly unavailable. A restaurant owner who'd expressed enthusiasm for carrying storm gold on his tables developed, overnight, a concern about supplier consistency that he couldn't quite explain when pressed. She was being cut off, methodically, professionally, with the particular efficiency of a man who had been doing this kind of thing for a long time and knew exactly how many moves he was ahead. The day the restaurant owner gave her his excuse, she walked back to her house in the cold and stood in the kitchen for a full 5 minutes without doing anything, just standing. Eli came in from the cellar with a crate and took one look at her and set it down quietly. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough." She pulled herself together, physically, visibly, the way she did it, squaring her shoulders and taking a breath that was slightly longer than normal. Not bad enough to stop. What are we going to do? She looked at the rows of storm gold jars on the shelf, 62 of them, waiting. We're going to stop trying to sell to the people Silas can reach, she said, and we're going to start selling to the people he can't. This was easier said than done, and the doing of it occupied the next 6 weeks in ways that tested her in every possible direction simultaneously. She found a rancher named Tom Garvey, 30 miles east of Ash Hollow, who'd been selling beef to a hotel in Denver for 2 years and had no connection to Silas Crow's network whatsoever because his business had grown up on the cattle side of the economy rather than the produce side. Tom was a quiet man with enormous hands and a skepticism about everything that came from a direction he hadn't encountered before. But he was also honest in the specific way that comes from spending your life dealing with animals that don't respond to manipulation. His wife, Clara, had gotten a jar of storm gold from a neighbor 3 weeks before and had served it to guests twice since. It's good, Tom said. He was sitting across from Mara in his own kitchen, which was larger than hers and colder. Clara says it's better than good, but I don't have her vocabulary for this kind of thing. What do you have vocabulary for? Mara asked. He looked at her steadily. I know the name of the purchasing manager at the Beaumont Hotel in Denver. I know he's particular about his suppliers. I know he's been looking for specialty food items that have a story to them because the guests ask where things come from now. He paused. And I know that Silas Crow has been trying to get into the Beaumont supply chain for 2 years and hasn't managed it because Gordon Beaumont doesn't trust anyone who comes in through a middleman. Mara went very still. Why are you telling me this? Tom Garvey's expression didn't change much, but something in it shifted. Because Silas Crow bought my neighbor's hay harvest at 40% below market value last year and called it a fair deal, and my neighbor couldn't argue because Crow was the only buyer. He looked at the jar of storm gold on the table between them. I don't know if you can pull this off, but I know I'd rather help you try than watch him keep running this valley the way he's been running it. She introduced herself to the Beaumont Hotel's purchasing manager through a letter that Tom Garvey co-signed. She wrote 3 drafts of it. The first was too formal, the second was too casual, the third, which she wrote at midnight when Eli was asleep and she was running on black coffee and stubbornness, was exactly what it needed to be. She told the truth. She said she ran a small preserve operation in Ash Hollow, Montana, that had started with $3 and 11 crates of storm-damaged peaches. She said she didn't have a formal distribution network. She said what she had was a product that tasted like something real, made the way it was made because she believed that damaged fruit still had value, and she'd been willing to do the work to prove it. She included a jar, packed in a small wooden box that Eli built specifically for the purpose, with the storm gold label, his lopsided peach with the honest bruise on it, facing up. She sent it and waited and tried not to think about it. While she was waiting, Silas made his third move. This one was not subtle at all. She came home from Ruth Hadley's house on a Tuesday evening to find a man she'd never seen before sitting on her porch steps. He was wearing a coat that was too good for Ash Hollow and carrying a leather case that suggested he was either a lawyer or wanted to appear to be one. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, standing when he saw her coming. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "My name is Caldwell. I represent Mr. Crow's business interests." He opened his leather case with a practiced efficiency that she recognized as theater. "I'm here regarding a matter of property assessment. It's come to our attention that the commercial operation you're running from this residence may be in violation of the county's guidelines on agricultural processing. We've had the relevant codes reviewed, and it appears the proper licensing was not obtained before." "Stop," Mara said. He stopped. "You are standing on my porch at 7 in the evening telling me that Silas Crow has found a licensing technicality." She looked at him with the specific calm of a woman who has already survived worse things than a man in a good coat on her porch. "Do you know what was here before this operation? A widow with $3 and a wood stove and a recipe she barely remembered. And now there are 62 jars in my cellar with orders attached to them and a boy inside who eats regular meals because of what those jars are worth." She tilted her head. "Go back and tell Silas that if he wants to have a legal conversation, he's welcome to have it in public. I'll be at the county offices Thursday morning." Caldwell looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he closed his leather case, nodded once, and left. She went inside and leaned against the closed door with her eyes shut for approximately 30 seconds. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Who was that?" "Trouble," she said. "The manageable kind." She was at the county offices Thursday morning, as promised, and what she found when she got there was that the licensing situation was real. There were codes, genuinely, and they did apply to what she was doing, and she did not have the proper filings. This was not something she could argue her way out of, and she didn't try. Instead, she filed the paperwork herself that same morning while sitting at a clerk's desk with a pen that kept skipping. The process took 4 hours and cost her money she hadn't planned to spend. When it was done, she had something Silas had clearly not expected her to have: legitimacy that he'd handed her by forcing her to get it. The clerk, an older man named Frank, who'd been processing county paperwork for 22 years, looked at her completed application and then looked at her. "You know," he said, not particularly to her, just into the air above his desk, "we don't see many new business filings this time of year. People usually wait until spring." He stamped her application. "Most people assume that if no one's come after them yet, they don't need to bother." "I like having things in order," Mara said. "Yes, ma'am." He handed her the copy. "Congratulations on your business." She walked out of the county offices into the November cold with her paperwork in her hand and the particular feeling that comes from having an enemy hand you a weapon. She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. The letter from the Beaumont Hotel arrived 3 days later. It was formal, typed on hotel stationery, and signed by someone named Ellsworth Vance, Purchasing and Guest Experience. It said, among other things, that the jar of preserve had been presented at the kitchen staff tasting that Monday and had received, in Mr. Vance's words, a response I have not seen to a single ingredient product in some years. It said he would like to discuss a formal supply agreement. It asked whether she could fulfill a trial order of 240 units. Units, she noted, not jars, which meant they were already thinking about this in a different register than she was, by the spring. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and sat down, which she did not usually do in the middle of the day. Eli came in from the cellar. He saw the letter. He saw her sitting down. "Good or bad?" She looked up at him. "The Beaumont Hotel in Denver wants 240 jars by spring." He was quiet for a moment. "We've never made 240 jars at once." "No," she said. "We haven't. Can we?" She looked around her kitchen, the wood stove, the shelf of jars, the canning equipment she'd been slowly building out over 2 months with every spare dollar, the cellar full of stock that was already spoken for, the order from Agnes Flint in Wyoming, and the 2 ranchers' wives who'd reached out last week about carrying storm gold in their communities. The whole fragile, growing, absolutely not finished thing she was building one batch at a time. "Not just the 2 of us," she said. He understood what she meant. She could see it in his face, the math of it and what the math meant. More hands, more equipment, more fruit, more money going out before it came back in, more risk. "Who do you trust?" he asked. It was a remarkably precise question for a 12-year-old. She thought about it seriously, the way it deserved. "Ruth," she said. "Hester Crane. Tom Garvey's wife Clara, if she's willing." She paused. "And I want to talk to some of the farmers who were at that Saturday meeting. The ones who looked like they were listening to Silas, but weren't sure they liked what they were hearing. What if they say no?" She picked up the letter from the Beaumont Hotel and looked at it again. 240 jars. Spring delivery. From a woman who had started with $3 and a memory. "Then I figure out how to do it with the people who say yes," she said. "Same as I've been doing." Outside her window, the sky over the mountains was the particular flat gray of a Montana winter afternoon, the color of something waiting to happen. She had 14 weeks until the spring deadline. She had a boy with a lingering cough and a borrowed cart, and a name that was starting to mean something beyond the borders of Ash Hollow. She also had Silas Crow, who had already tried the freight route and the licensing angle and the social pressure of a Saturday meeting, and who was not, she knew this with absolute certainty, finished trying. A man like Silas did not stop when his first 3 moves didn't work. He recalculated. He found the angle you hadn't protected yet. He came back quieter and from a direction you weren't watching. She pulled out her writing paper and started a list. Suppliers, equipment, people to approach, questions to answer, problems to solve before they became crises. The list got long quickly, the way honest lists always do. Eli sat down across from her without being asked and pulled the inventory ledger toward him, already running the numbers she was going to need. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. There was just the scratch of pen on paper in a warm kitchen, and outside the window the gray sky, and somewhere down the Denver road, a hotel purchasing manager who'd been surprised by a jar of peach preserve from a place he'd never heard of, written up on a label drawn by a boy in a second-hand coat. The work continued, which is what work does when you refuse to let it stop. Part 3. The bold gamble that changes everything. The list Mara had made that November evening grew into something she could barely recognize by the time January arrived. It covered 3 pages now, both sides, with additions squeezed into margins and lines crossed out and rewritten when she'd found better answers. Suppliers, equipment she still needed, names of people she'd talked to and what they'd said and what she thought they'd actually meant, numbers that almost worked, and the gap between almost and actually that kept her awake past midnight more nights than she could count. 240 jars by spring. 14 weeks when she'd written it down. Now 11. She'd done the honest accounting of it in the first week of January, sitting at her kitchen table with Eli across from her running figures. And what the honest accounting showed was this. She could not fill the Beaumont order alone. Not with her current equipment, not with her current cellar space, not with the two of them working every hour available. The math was simply against her, and the math didn't care how hard she worked or how much she needed it to come out differently. What she needed was help. Real help. Not the polite kind that people offer and then quietly forget about. And asking for real help, the kind that costs people something, the kind that requires them to put their own scarce resources behind someone else's gamble, was the hardest thing Mara Ellison had ever attempted to ask for. Harder than picking those $3 out of the mud. Harder than writing the letter to the Beaumont Hotel at midnight. Harder, even, than watching Daniel's fever climb past the point where she could pretend it was going to come back down. She was not, by nature or by practice, a woman who asked. She stood at her kitchen window on the first Saturday of January and looked at the snow-covered street and thought about Silas Crow, who had been quiet for 3 weeks now. She didn't trust the quiet. A man like Silas went quiet when he was finding the angle you hadn't thought to protect, and the angle she hadn't protected was the one she was staring at right now. She was undercapitalized, understaffed, and running on a timeline that had no room for error. If he found her mortgage, and he would find it, he probably already knew about it. And if he could apply pressure to the man who held the note, she would lose the house. The house was the kitchen. The kitchen was Storm Gold. Without the kitchen, there was no spring order, no Denver hotel, no Agnes Flint, no nothing. Just a woman and a boy and 60-odd jars of preserve that weren't going to be enough. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes, Eli said from behind her. She turned. He was at the table with the ledger, but he'd stopped writing. He was watching her with that particular attention of his, the focused, quiet kind that didn't ask for anything, just noticed. "I'm thinking," she said. "You're worried," he said, "which is different." She looked at him. 13 now. He'd had a birthday in December, which they'd marked with a dinner that was slightly better than a regular dinner, and a book about land surveying she'd found at the dry goods store, because he'd mentioned once in passing that he wanted to understand how land was measured. He'd read it twice already. She'd noticed without saying anything about it. "I need to ask people for help," she said, "and I don't know how to do that without making it sound like I'm failing." "Maybe it doesn't have to sound like anything," Eli said. "Maybe it just has to sound like what it is." She looked at him for a moment. "When did you get sensible?" "You've been feeding me regular meals for 4 months," he said. "It makes a difference." She almost smiled. She didn't quite, but she almost did, which was something. She started with Ruth Hadley, because Ruth was the person she trusted most, and because if she was going to be honest with anyone, she needed to practice being honest with someone she wasn't afraid of disappointing. She sat down at Ruth's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and laid it out plainly. The Beaumont order, the timeline, what she needed, what she had, and the exact size of the gap between those two numbers. She didn't soften it or frame it as anything other than what it was. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was not her natural tendency, but which she managed because she could see that Mara needed to finish the whole thing before she could bear to hear a response. When Mara finished, Ruth said, "What exactly are you asking me for?" "Time," Mara said. 2 or 3 days a week in my kitchen, through March. I can pay you. Not what your time is worth, but something, and a share of the order's profit when it ships." Ruth considered this. "I'm not a canner." "I know. I'll teach you what I know. The rest you'll pick up." She paused. "You're the most organized person I know, Ruth. That matters more than the technical part." Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup. Then she said, "My sister thinks I should mind my own business more." "Your sister thinks everyone should mind their business more." "That's true." Ruth looked up. "All right, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and I'll see about Saturdays." That was the first yes. Hester Crane said yes the same evening, when Mara stopped by on the way home. Hester was quieter about it. She just nodded twice and said she could come Mondays and Wednesdays, and she had her own canning equipment she could bring, which Mara hadn't even thought to ask about. "I want a piece of the label," Hester said when Mara was leaving. Mara stopped on the doorstep. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want it on the label somewhere. Not my name, maybe, but something." Hester looked at her steadily. "It was my peaches that started this. My 11 crates. I want to be part of what it became." Mara thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "The label will say Storm Gold Preserves, made in Ash Hollow, Montana, from fruit grown by local farms. Your name is in there." Hester nodded. That was enough for her. Claire Garvey said yes on Monday, with the additional offer of her husband Tom's barn as supplementary storage space for finished stock, which solved a problem Mara hadn't figured out how to solve yet and nearly undid her composure right there in Clara's front hallway. "Don't thank me," Clara said. "Tom's been wanting to do something about Silas Crow for 3 years. This is the first time he's had something worth doing." 3 yeses. 2 more people than she'd had before. It wasn't enough. The math still said it wasn't quite enough. But it changed the shape of what was possible. And changing the shape of what was possible was how you got to enough. The harder conversation was the one she'd been putting off, which was the farmers. There were 7 of them she'd identified over the past 2 months, men who'd been in Silas's orbit for years, who owed him money or favored him in contracts or simply couldn't afford to openly oppose him, but who'd shown, in small ways, signs of something other than complete loyalty. A look at the market that lasted a half-second too long. A comment about pricing that they'd walked back immediately. The particular silence of someone who wants to speak and has decided not to. She went to see each of them in January, spread across 2 weeks, and she was direct about why. She told them what the Beaumont order was. She told them what she was paying for fruit, damaged or good, versus what Silas was paying. She showed them the arithmetic on a piece of paper and let them sit with it. Most of them listened. 4 of them agreed to supply her directly, cutting Silas out of that transaction entirely. It was small. It wasn't public. But it was a crack in something that had seemed solid, and cracks spread. The 5th farmer she visited was a man named Walt Korber, who had the most acreage of any independent grower left in the county and who owed Silas Crow a substantial amount on a note that had been called in twice already and extended both times with new terms that were somehow always slightly worse than before. Walt was a big man who moved slowly and spoke even slower and had the kind of weathered patience that comes from decades of watching things you can't control. He listened to Mara's pitch without expression, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "Even if I wanted to deal with you directly," he said, "Silas holds my note. He finds out I'm selling to you, he calls it. I lose the farm." "I know," Mara said. "So what are you asking me for?" She hadn't been entirely sure until that moment. "I'm not asking you for your harvest yet," she said. "I'm asking you to remember this conversation. When things change, and they're going to change, Walt, I want you to remember that someone came and told you there was another way." He looked at her for a long moment. "You sound pretty sure things are going to change." "I am," she said. And she was, which was the strange part. It wasn't bravado. It was something that felt closer to arithmetic. She could see the direction things were moving, and the direction required that things change. The question was what it cost to get there. She was on her way home from Walt Kerber's farm, halfway down the frozen road, when she saw Silas Crow's wagon coming from the opposite direction. He saw her at the same moment. The road was narrow enough that one of them would have to pull aside, and for a moment neither of them did, and the two wagons slowed to a stop about 30 feet apart in the gray January afternoon, like something out of a story neither of them had intended to be in. Silas was alone in his wagon. He didn't have the lawyer, and he didn't have the smile he usually wore in public. He just looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read because it wasn't any of the things she expected. Not anger, not contempt, not calculation. It was something more like the look of a man reassessing a situation he'd thought he had mapped. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Crow," she said. They looked at each other across 30 feet of frozen road. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," she said. "The Beaumont Hotel." It wasn't a question. He'd found out. Of course he'd found out. A man like Silas had ears in every freight office and trading post between here and Denver. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horses stood patiently in the cold. "I'll be honest with you," he said, in the tone of a man who is about to be somewhat honest and somewhat not. "I underestimated you. I don't do that often." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you now as a courtesy." He picked up his reins. "Whatever you're building, it's not going to be enough. The valley runs on agreements that were made before you started and will be there after you finish. You can sell to Denver hotels and Wyoming mercantiles and wherever else you've reached, but you can't replace what I provide. People need what I have." "People need what they can get," Mara said. "That's different from needing what you have specifically." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was too fast to name. He clicked his tongue, and his horse moved forward, and she pulled her wagon to the side to let him pass. And he went by without looking at her again. She sat on the road for a moment after he'd gone. She didn't know if he believed what he'd said. She suspected he half believed it, which was the dangerous half. A man who half believes he's invincible still does all the same things a man who fully believes it does, but he does them with more calculation and less obvious pattern. She clicked her own horse forward and drove home through the gray afternoon, thinking about notes on farms and freight routes and the specific vulnerability of a business that was built on only one kitchen. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late January, and it was not from Denver. It was from the bank. Specifically, it was from the First Valley Bank of Ash Hollow, and it was addressed to Mrs. Mara Ellison, and it was regarding her mortgage, which had been held by said bank for 6 years without incident, and which was now being reviewed as part of a routine portfolio assessment, and which the bank wished to discuss with her at her earliest convenience. She read it twice. She set it on the table. She picked it up and read it a third time. Eli came in from the cellar and read her expression and said, "What is it?" She handed him the letter. He read it with the careful attention of a boy who'd taught himself to parse official language by necessity. He set it down. "Is Silas connected to that bank?" he asked. "His brother-in-law sits on the board," she said. Eli looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. "How much time do we have?" "They want a meeting in 2 weeks. And if the meeting goes badly..." She put the letter in the drawer where she kept important papers. "Then we find out what we're actually made of," she said. She went to the meeting alone because there was no one to bring who would make it go differently, and because some things you had to do in front of people who were trying to make you feel small without giving them the satisfaction of seeing that you'd brought reinforcements. The bank manager was a careful, soft-spoken man named Aldrich, who had the look of someone executing someone else's decision and being only slightly uncomfortable about it. He told her the bank was concerned about the commercial nature of operations at her residential property, and about her ability to service the mortgage given the early stage of her business, and about something called operational risk assessment that he explained at length in a way that added up to, "We can call this note if we want to, and we're thinking about wanting to." Mara listened to all of it. Then she opened her bag and set on the desk, one at a time, the following items: her county business license, obtained in November, her signed supply agreement with the Beaumont Hotel in Denver, her accounts ledger for the past 4 months, showing revenue, expenses, and a growth curve that went only in one direction, and a letter from Agnes Flint in Wyoming, written in that hard, slanting handwriting, saying that Storm Gold Preserves had sold out of 3 restocking orders in 60 days, and she wanted to triple her standing order beginning in March. She let him read all of it without saying anything. When he looked up, she said, "I would like to know who requested this review." He looked at her carefully. "Portfolio reviews are standard procedure." "They are," she said. "I'd still like to know." He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to. She picked up her documents, put them back in her bag, stood up, and said, "I'll have my February payment to you before the 15th, same as every month for 6 years." She put on her coat. "I trust the review will find things in order." She walked out of the bank into the January cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing. Her hands were not entirely steady. She put them in her pockets so no one would notice. The thing about being frightened, she'd learned, was that you could be frightened and still move forward. The fear was its own kind of information. It told you what was real and what mattered. You just couldn't let it make the decisions. She walked to Ruth Hadley's house and knocked on the door. Ruth answered, took one look at her, and said, "Come in and sit down." "I'm all right," Mara said. "You're white as flour. Come in and sit down." She sat down. She told Ruth everything: the bank letter, the meeting, Aldrich's careful language, the documents she'd brought. Ruth listened and said nothing until Mara finished. Then she refilled both their coffee cups and sat down across from her. "What do you need?" Ruth asked. "I need people to know," Mara said. "Not in a way that sounds like I'm panicking, but the people who are with me. They need to know that Silas is going after the bank, because the next move might be something worse, and I don't want anyone to be surprised." "I can do that," Ruth said, quietly. "Quietly," Mara agreed. Word moved through the community the way it always did in Ash Hollow, through kitchens and back porches, and the particular frequency of women talking to each other across fences. Within 4 days, the people who mattered knew what was happening. And what Mara had not anticipated, what surprised her more than anything Silas had done, was the response. Hester Crane came to her kitchen on a Saturday morning with $40 in a cigar box and set it on the table without preamble. "That's my savings," Hester said. "Whatever you need it for." Mara looked at the box. She looked at Hester. "I can't take your savings." "You're not taking it. I'm investing it." Hester pulled out a chair and sat down. "I know what Storm Gold is. I was there at the start. I want a formal piece of it." 2 hours later, Clara Garvey arrived with Tom, who was carrying a paper he'd had drawn up by a different lawyer in a town 30 miles away. A simple partnership document that gave the Garveys a 5% share of Storm Gold in exchange for the barn storage, and a cash contribution that made Mara sit down heavily in her chair when she read the number. "Tom," she said. "Don't," he said. "Just sign it." A Ben Denton came on Sunday. Then one of the immigrant farming families from the eastern edge of town, a couple named Vasek, who'd been dealing with Crow's pricing since they arrived 6 years ago and had never had another option. They brought what they had, which was less than the others. Mara wrote down every name and every amount with the same careful handwriting, like each one was a document she intended to keep forever, which she did. Eli sat in the corner through most of these visits, writing in the ledger, tracking the numbers as they came in. On Sunday evening, after the Vaseks left, he set down his pencil and said, "We have enough." She looked up from the letter she was writing. "With what we have from sales and what everyone's put in, if we're careful, we have enough to fill the Beaumont order and keep the mortgage current through March." He ran his finger down the column. "It's close, but it's enough." She looked at the ledger. She looked at the column of names above the numbers. People who had put their own scarce things behind her scarce thing because they'd decided that what she was doing was worth the risk. She was not a woman who cried easily. She'd been operating for months on the specific emotional economy of someone who knows that if she comes apart, everything built around her will wobble, and so she'd been holding herself together by force of habit and stubbornness and the inability to imagine what coming apart would even accomplish. But she sat there for a moment with Eli's ledger in front of her and felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time. "Good," she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. "Good." Eli looked at her, then looked back at his ledger with great interest in the numbers, giving her a moment she hadn't asked for but needed. They went into the final push in February with 5 people working in her kitchen on rotation: herself, Ruth, Hester, Clara Garvey on the days she could come, and a young woman named Petra Vasek, who turned out to have remarkable steadiness and no tolerance for imprecision, which made her invaluable at the sealing stage. Eli ran logistics, supplies coming in, finished stock going to Tom's barn. The ledger kept current to the day. The kitchen was hot and loud and constantly slightly chaotic. There were days when the timing went wrong and a batch had to be started over, which cost time and sugar and the particular frustrated silence of 5 people trying not to say the thing they were all thinking. There were days when Mara's back hurt so badly she had to sit down every hour, which she resented bitterly and did anyway because collapsing was the alternative. There were days when Eli's cough came back and she made him sit near the window and pretended she wasn't watching him the way she was watching him. And then there was the morning, a Tuesday, in the first week of March, when Silas Crow's lawyer appeared not at her door but at Tom Garvey's barn. Tom came to her directly. He arrived at her kitchen door before 7 in the morning, still in his barn coat, and told her without sitting down. Caldwell, the same man with the good coat and the leather case, had served Tom with a notice claiming that the storage arrangement at Garvey's barn constituted unauthorized commercial activity on agricultural zoned land and was in violation of a county ordinance that Silas's people had apparently spent some time identifying. Tom's jaw was set in the particular way of a man who has decided how he feels about something. "He's going after my barn now." Mara stood at her wood stove. She didn't move for a moment. She was calculating, not just the legal angle, but the psychological one. Silas was applying pressure sideways. He'd gone around her and hit the people supporting her, which was more sophisticated and also more telling than anything he'd done before. It meant he'd realized he couldn't move her directly. It meant he was trying to use the weight of her community against her, hoping someone would decide the cost was too high and step back, and then another person would follow, and the whole thing would unravel from the outside in. "He's hoping you'll pull out," she said. "I know what he's hoping," Tom said. "Are you?" He looked at her steadily. "No, but I need to know what you're going to do about it." She took the Beaumont letter out of the drawer and set it on the table. 240 jars, spring delivery, the kind of contract that made the whole operation visible to people outside the valley. "I need 1 more week to fill this order," she said. "When this ships, it's not local anymore. When a Denver hotel is your customer, the conversation about whether you're a legitimate business is over. Silas knows that. That's why he's doing this now." She looked at Tom. "Can you hold him off for 1 week?" "Legally? Is there a legal way to do it?" Tom thought about it. "I can file a counter notice contesting the ordinance. Takes 2 weeks minimum to resolve." "Then file it today," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on and left. Mara stood in her kitchen after he'd gone, alone for a moment before the others arrived, with the wood stove ticking and the shelves lined with storm gold jars, and 11 weeks of work stacked in Tom Garvey's barn. And she thought about Silas in his warehouse calculating his next move. And she thought about Walt Korber on his mortgaged farm, remembering their conversation on the frozen road. She thought about what she'd said to him. "I want you to remember that someone came and told you there was another way." She'd believed it when she said it. She had to keep believing it now, even with a lawyer's notice sitting on Tom Garvey's kitchen table and a bank manager's careful voice still running through her memory, and 11 weeks of work that could still be undone by the right kind of pressure applied to the right person at the right moment. The others arrived at 7:30. Ruth first, then Hester, then Petra Vasek, then Eli from upstairs where he'd been sleeping. The kitchen filled with the noise and heat and organized chaos of people who'd been doing this long enough to have their own rhythms now, their own shorthand, their own slightly sharp-edged jokes about whose batch had been better last Tuesday. Mara tied her apron and went to the stove. 1 more week. 240 jars, 1 shipment going down the Denver road that would make everything Silas was doing either too late or not enough. She started the first batch of the morning and the kitchen filled with that smell. The deep, warm, complicated smell that had started with 11 crates of damaged peaches and a memory of her grandmother's hands and $3 picked up out of the mud. The smell of a thing that had survived being ruined and come out the other side as something worth keeping. Outside the window, March had come to Ash Hollow. The snow was still on the ground, but the light was changing. You could feel it, the slow, reluctant shift of a Montana winter deciding it had gone on long enough. Eli pressed lids. Hester labeled jars. Ruth managed the stove rotation with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. Petra checked seals without being asked. Mara stirred and watched and thought, and did not let herself stop moving. The week ahead was going to be the hardest thing she'd built toward since the morning she'd crouched in the mud and picked up her own $3 while Silas Crow walked away. The difference was that this time, she wasn't crouching alone. Part 4. The Empire Begins to Collapse. The 240 jars shipped on a Thursday morning in the second week of March. Mara was there when Odell loaded the last crate onto his wagon, the same Odell who had come to her door in November with his hat in his hand to tell her about the rerouted freight manifest. He'd volunteered for this run specifically, which she hadn't asked him to do, and which he didn't explain, and which he understood without needing it explained. Each crate was packed in straw, reinforced with the extra slats Eli had been cutting since January, and labeled on the outside in Mara's handwriting, Storm Gold Preserves, Ash Hollow, Montana, for the Beaumont Hotel, Denver. She'd written it out herself on every crate, all 16 of them, because she wanted her handwriting on the thing. She wanted the physical fact of her hand to travel down that road. Eli stood beside her watching Odell tie down the load. He was taller than he'd been in September. She'd noticed it happen gradually, the way you notice weather changing, the daily increments invisible, until one morning you realize the season has shifted. He had the focused, quiet look he got when something mattered, and he was trying not to show how much. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked him. "What's there to say?" He watched Odell check the ropes. "We did the work. It either gets there or it doesn't." "It'll get there," she said. "I know." He paused. "I'm not worried about that part." She knew what part he was worried about. The same part she was worried about, which was the part that happened after the jars arrived. Whether Ellsworth Vance of the Beaumont Hotel would look at 240 jars from a woman in Montana and feel the same thing he'd felt when he'd tasted the first one, or whether that had been a moment that couldn't be repeated at scale. Some things were like that. They worked in small doses and fell apart when you tried to make them bigger. She'd spent enough time lying awake thinking about this possibility that she recognized it as the fear that lived underneath all the other fears. The one that wasn't about Silas or banks or legal notices, but about whether what she'd made was actually as good as she thought it was, or whether she'd been too close to it too long to see it clearly. Odell climbed onto his wagon, looked down at her and said, "I'll take care of it, Mrs. Ellison." "I know you will," she said. She watched the wagon move down the street until it turned the corner and was gone. Then she went back inside to make the next batch, because there was another order behind the Beaumont and another one behind that, and the work didn't pause to let you feel things about it. The legal counter notice Tom Garvey had filed on the barn ordinance was still working its way through the county process, which meant Silas couldn't act on it yet, which bought the time she'd needed. But the situation had shifted in a way she felt more than she could precisely name. The pressure from Silas's direction had gone slightly quieter in the past 2 weeks, and quiet from Silas never meant nothing. It meant he was doing something she hadn't seen yet. She found out what it was on a Saturday, through a source she hadn't expected. Walt Korber came to her door. He didn't knock at first. She heard boots on the porch and then a pause, long enough that she'd already set down what she was doing and gone to the door before he'd raised his hand to knock. He was standing there with his hat in both hands, which on a man his size looked like a gesture that had cost him something to make. "I need to talk to you," he said. She stepped back and let him in. She poured coffee because it was the only social machinery she had available at that moment, and because Walt Korber standing in her kitchen was not a thing she'd expected to be managing today. He sat at the table and turned his hat in his hands and didn't drink the coffee. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was now on the other side of it, dealing with the weight of what the decision actually meant. "Silas came to see me," he said. She sat down across from him. "When?" "Last week. Then again 3 days ago." He set the hat on the table, which meant he'd stopped needing something to do with his hands because he'd gotten to the part he'd actually come to say. "He's trying to consolidate the note on my farm, buy it from the bank, which would make him my direct creditor instead of First Valley." Mara went very still. "He's buying your debt." "Trying to. The bank hasn't agreed yet, but Aldrich isn't exactly putting up a fight." Walt looked at his coffee cup. "If Silas holds my note, he owns me. Any agreement I make with you, any supplier deal, any direct sale that cuts him out. He calls the note, and I'm done." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." He looked up at her. "I've been thinking about it." She waited. She'd learned in the past several months that waiting was sometimes the most useful thing you could do in a conversation. People filled silence with what they'd actually come to say. "He's doing the same thing to Vasek," Walt said, "and to Pete Henning out east. Anyone who's been talking to you or supplying you. He's going after the debt. He doesn't have to stop you directly. He just has to own everyone around you until you don't have anyone left to work with." The shape of it came clear all at once, the way things do when you finally have enough pieces. It wasn't just pressure on individual people. It was a systematic acquisition of leverage, buying debt, controlling credit, positioning himself so that every person in her supply chain was, technically and legally, answerable to him. It was patient, and it was thorough, and it would, if he managed to complete it, be very nearly impossible to fight. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Walt looked at her with the steady, slow honesty of a man who'd spent decades dealing with animals and weather and things you couldn't manipulate. "Because you came to my farm in January and told me there was another way, and I didn't believe you enough to do anything about it then." He picked up his hat again. "I'm choosing to believe you now, whatever that's worth." It was worth a great deal, though she didn't say that immediately. What she said was, "I need to make some calls. Can you give me until Monday?" "He hasn't completed the purchase yet. I've got a week, maybe 2, before it's settled." "Monday?" she said. "I'll have something for you by Monday." He nodded, stood up, and put his hat on. He looked around her kitchen, at the jars on the shelf, at the canning equipment, at the ledger on the table that was full of names and numbers that represented a community that had decided to do something different. He had the expression of a man seeing something for the first time that he'd been told was there but hadn't looked at directly. "It smells good in here," he said. Not like a compliment, like an honest observation. "Come back Monday," she said. "I'll have coffee and an answer." After he left, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Eli came downstairs. It was early afternoon, a Saturday, and he'd been working on the accounts, and found her in the particular stillness that meant she was thinking through something with all of herself. He sat down without asking, opened the ledger to a blank page, and waited. "Silas is buying debt," she said. "Everyone who's connected to us, suppliers, storage, anyone who's been helping, he's acquiring their loans so he can use the threat of foreclosure to cut them off from us." Eli wrote something at the top of the blank page. She couldn't see what. "How many people?" "Walt thinks at least 3 for certain, probably more we don't know about yet." "Can we pay the debts off?" "Not even close." He thought about it. "Can we move the debts somewhere else? Different bank? Different creditor?" She looked at him. He was 13 years old, and he had just identified the correct question, which was the question she'd been working toward herself, but hadn't quite gotten to yet. "That depends on whether there's a creditor willing to take them," she said slowly, "and whether they do it on terms that don't replace one problem with another." "Agnes Flint," Eli said. She looked at him sharply. "She's written 3 times since the first order. She wants to expand. She said her brother runs a credit union in Wyoming. She mentioned it in the last letter, almost like she was—" He stopped. "I don't know. Like she was offering something without saying it directly." Mara stood up and went to the drawer where she kept correspondence. She found Agnes Flint's most recent letter, the one with the hard, slanting handwriting postmarked Copper Ridge, Wyoming, 2 weeks ago, and read it again with fresh attention. "My brother, Gerald Flint, operates the Copper Ridge Cooperative Credit, which has been extending agricultural credit in our region for 11 years. He has been following the progress of your operation with some interest, as I have shared your letters with him. He would welcome a conversation about expansion financing, if that becomes relevant to your plans." She set the letter down. "She was offering something without saying it directly," Mara said. Eli nodded. "Are you going to write back?" "I'm going to do something faster than writing," she said. She sent a telegram to Copper Ridge, Wyoming that afternoon. The first telegram she'd ever sent on behalf of Storm Gold, and it cost her more per word than she was comfortable with, but some things couldn't wait for a letter's transit time. She kept it brief because brevity was cheaper, and because what she needed to say was not complicated, situation urgent. Interested in discussing credit arrangement for agricultural partners in Ash Hollow area. Please advise on fastest method of communication. M. Ellison, Storm Gold Preserves. Gerald Flint's response came back the following day, Sunday, which told her he'd been waiting for something like this, or was at minimum the kind of man who worked Sundays, which amounted to the same thing in terms of usefulness. He said he was prepared to travel to Ash Hollow within the week if she could confirm the conversation was worth the trip. She confirmed it. He arrived on Wednesday, which was faster than she'd expected. He was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s who looked like his sister in the jaw and moved like someone who made financial decisions the way other people made ordinary ones, quickly, without drama, based on information rather than impression. He sat in her kitchen, drank her coffee without commenting on it, read through the accounts ledger that Eli had prepared, and asked 11 questions that got progressively more specific and revealed a thorough understanding of what a cooperative credit structure could and couldn't absorb. When he finished, he looked at her over the ledger and said, "You're asking me to buy out the agricultural loans of your associated farmers and suppliers, consolidate them under a cooperative structure, and offer them terms that make it impossible for Silas Crow to use debt as leverage against your network." "Yes," she said. "That's a significant exposure for a credit union our size." "I know." "What are you offering in return?" She'd thought about this carefully. "A formal preferred supplier agreement. Storm Gold commits to sourcing from cooperative members as first priority at published prices for a minimum of 3 years. Every farmer who moves their debt to your institution becomes a guaranteed supplier with a guaranteed buyer. That's collateral that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but it's real." Gerald Flint looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling he was calculating something that had nothing to do with numbers. "My sister says you started this with $3, he said. "And 11 crates of damaged peaches," she said. He almost smiled. "The Beaumont Hotel order shipped last week." "It did. I have a contact at the Beaumont. I took the liberty of making an inquiry before I came." He closed the ledger. "Ellsworth Vance says the kitchen staff is asking when the next shipment comes. He's considering doubling the standing order." She kept her face still. It was one of the hardest things she'd done in months. "That's good to know," she said. Gerald Flint nodded once. "I'll need 3 days to prepare the formal structure. I'd like to meet with each of the affected farmers individually before anything is signed, and I want your accounts kept current to the week. Your boy's ledger work is excellent, by the way. He should consider bookkeeping as a vocation." Eli, who was at the sink and had been pretending not to listen for the past 20 minutes, went extremely still. "I'll tell him," Mara said. The 3 days Gerald Flint had asked for turned into 5, because the reality of restructuring agricultural debt was more complicated than even his practiced efficiency could simplify. But they were a productive 5 days. He met with Walt Korber, the Voseks, Pete Henning, and 2 other farmers that Mara hadn't known were in Silas's debt acquisition sites. Every meeting happened quietly, in kitchens and barns, without announcement. Silas found out, inevitably. He found out on the 4th day, from some thread in his network that Mara would never be able to identify, and his response was immediate. He went directly to the First Valley Bank and attempted to complete the purchase of Walt Korber's note before Gerald Flint could get the paperwork in place. Walt called it a warning. What it was, in practice, was a race. Mara found out about the race from Tom Garvey, who'd heard it from the clerk at First Valley, who had apparently felt that someone should know and had chosen Tom because Tom was the kind of man people chose when they wanted something to actually get done. She drove to Gerald Flint's temporary office. He'd taken a room at the boarding house on Maple Street in less than 10 minutes and knocked on his door at 7 in the evening. He opened it in his shirt sleeves, which was the first time she'd seen him without his jacket, and which made him look less like a credit officer and more like a person. "Silas is moving on Korber's note tonight or tomorrow," she said. "Once he has it, the others will follow because he'll use Walt as an example. We need the Korber restructuring completed before First Valley can process his purchase." Gerald Flint looked at her for a moment. "I have the paperwork prepared. What I don't have is Walt Korber's signature, which I was planning to get tomorrow morning." "Get it tonight," she said. He looked at her steadily. Then he picked up his jacket. They drove to Walt Korber's farm in Gerald's rented buggy in the dark, on frozen roads, arriving at 8:30 to find Walt in his barn doing the kind of late-night animal tending that farmers did when they couldn't sleep and needed something practical to occupy their hands. He listened to Gerald's explanation, read the document in the light of the barn lantern, asked 2 questions, and signed it on the flat top of a hay bale. "That's it?" Walt asked. "That's it," Gerald said. "First Valley will receive notification of the transfer first thing tomorrow morning. By the time Mr. Crow's purchase processes through their system, the note will no longer be available for acquisition." Walt looked at the signed document. He had the expression of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was trying to understand what it felt like to set it down. "What do I owe you?" he asked Gerald. "Competitive interest in a 3-year supply agreement with Storm Gold Preserves," Gerald said, "which Mrs. Ellison has already formalized." Walt nodded. He looked at Mara. "You came through," he said. "We came through," she said. The notification reached First Valley Bank the next morning at 8 o'clock, 40 minutes before Silas Crow's lawyer arrived to complete the debt purchase. She didn't witness this directly. She heard about it afterward from Frank, the county clerk, who'd heard it from someone at the bank, who described the specific quality of the silence in Aldrich's office when Caldwell was informed that the note in question had been transferred to an out-of-state cooperative credit institution and was no longer part of First Valley's portfolio. The silence, reportedly, lasted a long time. The restructuring of the other 5 farmers' debts was completed over the following 2 weeks, each one moving quietly and efficiently through Gerald Flint's process before Silas could position himself to interfere. It wasn't dramatic in the way that Mara had sometimes imagined victory might be. There was no confrontation, no single moment of reversal. It was a sequence of signatures on documents, of paperwork filed and processed, of debts moving from one ledger to another. Unglamorous. Effective. What it did, systematically, was remove Silas Crow's ability to use financial pressure as a tool against the people in Mara's network. One by one, the levers he'd been acquiring were transferred to an institution that had no relationship with him and no reason to act on his behalf. The ordinance challenge on Tom Garvey's barn was resolved in Tom's favor 2 weeks later. The county clerk ruled that the storage arrangement did not constitute unauthorized commercial activity under the applicable codes, and that the notice Caldwell had served was based on an overly broad interpretation of the ordinance. Tom framed the ruling and put it on the wall of his barn, which Mara thought was perhaps excessive, but said nothing about because some victories deserved a frame. The change in Ash Hollow was not sudden. It was gradual, and it happened in the register of small things. A farmer who'd been selling to Silas exclusively for years came to ask about Storm Gold's supplier terms. A merchant who'd declined to carry the preserve in November quietly reversed course and sent a note asking about availability. People who'd kept their distance began to not keep it, which was its own kind of movement. And then came the morning that changed the weight of everything, and it came from a direction no one had been watching. A man named Harrison Pruitt arrived in Ash Hollow on the last Tuesday of March. He was from the Territorial Commerce Division, a regulatory body that had been, until recently, largely theoretical in the day-to-day life of the valley. He had a letter from someone in the division's Denver office and a collection of documents that he'd apparently been assembling for longer than anyone in Ash Hollow realized. He came to Mara first, which surprised her. He sat in her kitchen. Her kitchen, she noted, was becoming the place where everything happened, which felt appropriate in a way she couldn't fully articulate, and told her that the Commerce Division had been investigating price manipulation in agricultural trading networks across the territory for the past 18 months. He said Ash Hollow had come to their attention some months ago. He said he was not at liberty to disclose the specific source of the information that had brought them here. "What do you need from me?" Mara asked. "Nothing, currently," Pruitt said. "I wanted to introduce myself and let you know that the investigation is active." He looked around the kitchen with the careful, noticing attention of a man who documented things for a living. "I've been made aware of your operation. It's relevant context for what we're examining." "How relevant?" "Your pricing records," he said carefully, "your supplier agreements, and the documented market conditions in this valley over the past 2 years represent a useful comparative baseline for evaluating the practices we're investigating." She understood. What he was telling her, in the precise language of regulatory caution, was that what she'd built, the honest prices, the written agreements, the ledger that Eli had kept current to the week, was evidence. Not of wrongdoing on her part, but of what honest practice looked like, which made Silas's version of practice visible by contrast. "My accounts ledger is available to any authorized review," she said. My supplier agreements are all in writing. My pricing is published and consistent. I expected as much, Pruitt said. He stood, thanked her for the coffee, and left. She sat at the table for a moment after he was gone. Then she went to the cellar, came back up with a jar of storm gold, and set it on the windowsill where the March light hit it. The color of it, that particular amber gold that Eli had named before they'd known what they were naming, caught the light and held it. She thought about Silas, not with anger exactly, and not with satisfaction either. Something more complicated than either of those. The feeling of watching something large and heavy begin to move in a direction it hadn't been moving before. Knowing that once things that size start moving, they don't stop quickly. He didn't know yet, she thought. Or he knew something was happening and didn't know the shape of it yet. Either way, the next few weeks were going to show him. Pruitt met with 7 people in the following days. Farmers, former employees of Silas's trading operation, a freight dispatcher who'd been working Silas's routes for years and apparently had things to say that he'd been waiting for the right listener to say them to. The meetings were private, but in a town Ash Hollow's size, the fact of the meetings was not private, and the fact of the meetings meant something. Ben Denton came to Mara's kitchen on a Thursday evening. He sat down and put both hands flat on the table like he was bracing himself. I signed contracts with Silas 3 years ago, he said. Fixed pricing, exclusivity clauses, the whole thing. At the time, I thought it was fair. Looking back, he stopped. Looking back, I understand what I signed differently than I did then. Did you talk to Pruitt? She asked. Yesterday. His hands were still flat on the table. I showed him the contracts. He had questions about the pricing formulas built into them. Specific questions, like he already knew what to look for. She said nothing. Mara. Ben looked at her with the direct honesty of a man past the age of being careful with words. Is this thing going to come down? Silas's whole operation? Is it actually coming down? She thought about what she actually knew versus what she believed, and she tried to be honest about the difference. I think the people who should be looking at how this valley has been operating are looking at it, she said. What they find is going to be what they find. I don't control that part. But you knew they were looking. I knew someone had asked questions that I answered honestly, she said. That's all I did. He sat with that for a moment. I want to sign a supplier agreement with you, he said. Direct, no middleman. I know, she said. I've been waiting for you to ask. The Territorial Commerce Division's preliminary findings were issued in the second week of April. Mara got a copy from Pruitt, not before it was public, but at the same time it became public, which she suspected was intentional. The document was technical and measured in its language, the way regulatory documents always were. But what it described in that measured language was 11 years of systematic price manipulation across the Valley's produce trading network. Fixed buying prices that bore no relationship to actual market conditions. Exclusivity contracts with penalty clauses that effectively prevented farmers from seeking better terms. Freight route arrangements that created artificial scarcity of supply for independent operators. Informal agreements with the First Valley Bank regarding loan terms for Crow-affiliated clients versus non-affiliated ones. It named Silas Crow's operation as the central structure of the network. It named specific practices. It named dates. Mara read it at her kitchen table, slowly, from the first page to the last. Eli read it over her shoulder, which she normally would have said something about, but she didn't. When she finished, she set it down. Is that enough? Eli asked. I don't know, she said honestly. It's a preliminary finding. There will be more process. These things take time. She looked at the document. But it's real. It's in writing, from people whose job it is to say what's true about these things. What happens to Silas now? She thought about Silas on the frozen road in January, saying people need what I have with that half-belief in his voice. She thought about him dropping her $3 in the mud and walking away without looking back. I think, she said slowly, that he's about to find out what it feels like when the thing you've built stops being supported by the people who were holding it up. The first visible sign of it came the following week. 3 of Silas's long-term contracted farmers announced they would not be renewing their exclusivity agreements when the current contracts expired at the end of the season. They didn't make public statements about it. They just didn't renew. which in the arithmetic of Silas's operation meant the beginning of a contraction that, once started, tended to continue. A freight dispatcher who'd worked his routes filed a formal complaint with the division's office in Denver, detailing specific instances of route manipulation. 2 former employees of his trading operation provided written statements. The bank examiner, who came in from Helena to review First Valley's lending practices, spent 4 days in Aldrich's office going through records, and whatever he found there was apparently significant enough that Aldrich was put on administrative leave before the end of the week. It didn't happen the way stories usually make collapse happen. Not dramatically, not all at once, not with a single moment of reckoning where everything reversed. It happened the way real things collapse. Gradually, from multiple directions, as the weight of accumulated evidence and consequence pressed against a structure that had been held together by fear and compliance rather than anything solid. Remove the fear, document the compliance, apply the weight of process, slow and unglamorous as it was, and the structure didn't explode. It deflated. Silas Crow was seen less and less in the public spaces of Ash Hollow. His warehouse stayed open for a while, running on momentum and existing contracts. But the new contracts weren't coming, and the existing ones were leaking at the edges. The freight operation began contracting. People who'd been careful around him stopped being careful in the specific guarded way they'd been careful before, which was its own kind of measurement. Walt Korber's farm didn't get called. His debt sat quietly in the Copper Ridge Cooperative's portfolio, with interest terms he could actually service and no clause that let anyone use it as a weapon. The Vaseks planted their spring crop without anyone telling them what price they'd be receiving for it at harvest. Pete Henning bought new equipment for the first time in 4 years. Mara watched all of this from her kitchen, where the wood stove was working well this spring, and the latest batch was on, and the smell of storm gold filled the house the way it had since September. She watched it without celebration because celebration felt like exactly the wrong note. Too light for what the past months had actually cost the people who'd been living under Silas's network for years, and too easy for what had actually changed and what still needed to. Ruth came by on a Wednesday afternoon in April and sat at the kitchen table and watched Mara work without saying anything for a while, which was unusual enough for Ruth that Mara finally said, "What?" "I've been thinking," Ruth said, "about what this looks like in 10 years. "What does it look like?" Ruth turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I think it looks like something people here needed and didn't know they needed because they'd been told for so long that what they had was the only option." She looked up. "I think it looks like Ash Hollow being a different kind of place." Mara stirred the batch on the stove. The smell rose in the warm kitchen, peaches and spice, and the particular depth of something cooked slowly with attention. "That's a lot of weight to put on peach preserve," she said. "Is it?" Ruth asked. Mara thought about Eli pressing lids with the methodical care of a boy who'd decided something was worth doing correctly. She thought about Hester Crane setting $40 in a cigar box on her table and calling it an investment. She thought about Walt Korber signing a document on a hay bale in the dark. She thought about Ben Denton's hands flat on the table, bracing for honesty. "Maybe not," she said. She turned back to the stove. Outside the window, April had brought the first warmth to Ash Hollow, the kind of warmth that meant things were about to start growing again. The winter had been long, and the ground had been frozen a long time, and now the thaw was coming, and the thaw was going to reveal what had survived underneath. Mara Ellison had survived underneath. So had the people around her. What came next was going to be different. Not easier, necessarily, because different and easier were not the same thing, and she'd learned to distrust any version of the future that didn't include work and difficulty and moments where the right choice was the hard one. But different. Changed. In the specific way that things change when someone refuses to accept that what exists is the only thing that can exist. She kept stirring. Eli came downstairs from the accounts room. She'd given him the small bedroom off the landing as a workspace because he'd outgrown the kitchen table and because watching a 13-year-old manage a growing business's books on a surface also covered with canning equipment was inefficient, and appeared in the kitchen doorway with the ledger under his arm. "Agnes Flint's brother is asking about expanding the cooperative into Wyoming," he said. "Gerald Flint sent a letter. He wants to know if you'd be interested in a formal advisory role." She looked at him. "A formal advisory role. That's what the letter says." He set it on the table for her to read. He says your model is replicable. He says what you did here, the direct supplier agreements, the cooperative credit structure, the bypassing of the monopoly network. He says other communities are dealing with the same problem, and your approach worked. She looked at the letter, then she looked at Eli. What do you think? She asked. He had the expression he got when he'd already thought about something for a while, and had an opinion he wasn't sure she wanted to hear. I think we're not done here yet, he said. I think there's still work to do in Ash Hollow before we start advising people somewhere else. You're right, she said. He looked slightly surprised she'd said it that simply. You're not going to argue? You're right, she said again. Write back to Gerald Flint. Tell him we're honored by the interest, and we'll be in touch when the time is right. He went to write the letter. She went back to the stove. The batch needed another 20 minutes. She set her timer, a small mechanical thing she'd bought in February because she'd ruined one too many batches by losing track of time when conversations happened, and stood over the pot with her stirring spoon and thought about what Ash Hollow looked like from the outside, to a man in Wyoming with a letter from his sister, and what it would look like in a year, and what she wanted it to look like in 5. She thought about $3 in the mud and 11 crates of damaged peaches and a recipe she'd barely remembered, and a name a 13-year-old had come up with while sealing jars on a September evening. She thought about what her grandmother's kitchen had smelled like 40 years ago in Ohio, when the summer was coming in through the windows and the preserve was on the stove and everything felt like it was being kept. She stirred and the smell rose around her, and outside the kitchen window April was working on Ash Hollow the way seasons always worked, slow, insistent, and completely indifferent to whether you were ready for it. She was ready for it. Part 5. A legacy built from what others threw away. Spring came to Ash Hollow the way it always did in Montana, reluctantly, with setbacks, 2 steps forward and 1 step back through April, until May finally committed and the cold released its hold on the ground with a kind of grudging acceptance. The peach trees that had survived the hailstorm came back with the particular stubbornness of things that have already proven they can survive the worst the season can offer. They bloomed unevenly, some branches fuller than others, carrying the evidence of last year's damage in their shape the way living things carry damage. Not hidden, not erased, just incorporated into what they'd become. Mara noticed this on a morning in early May when she walked the edge of the Denton orchard, which Ben had invited her to see in advance of the season's first assessments. She wasn't a farmer, and she didn't pretend to understand trees the way Ben did, but she understood what she was looking at in the way you understand things when you've spent enough time paying attention to them. They look different than before the storm, she said. Ben walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, squinting at the branches the way farmers squint at things they've spent years learning to read. They are different, he said. The ones that made it through. They grew back stronger in some places and thinner in others. You can't predict which. The storm changed the shape of them. Does that affect the fruit? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way Ben Denton thought about things now. The fruit from the damaged trees last year was smaller, more concentrated, different flavor profile than what we usually got. He paused. Your preserve had a depth to it that regular peaches wouldn't have given you. Some of that was your recipe. Some of it was the fruit itself, what it had been through. She stood there in the May morning, looking at the uneven, surviving trees, and thought that this was one of those moments where the world was saying something obvious if you were willing to hear it. I want a supply agreement with you, she said, for this season's harvest. Damaged fruit at fair price and first right of refusal on the grade 2 stock. I was going to bring that up myself, Ben said. What's your number? She told him her number. He didn't argue with it, which was how she knew the number was fair. Fair pricing produces a moment of consideration, not immediate agreement and not immediate argument. Ben considered it for about 10 seconds and then said yes. They shook hands in the orchard with the uneven trees around them and the smell of spring on everything, and Mara thought about Silas buying Ben's damaged harvest for 2 cents a bushel, while Ben tried not to cry. A year and a half ago. It felt like a different era of the world, though the distance was measured in months rather than years. The Territorial Commerce Division's formal findings were published in June, The full document ran to 43 pages, which Mara read in the evenings over the course of a week, seated at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her while the house settled around her. It was thorough. It documented 11 years of pricing manipulation across the Valley's produce network. It named contracts, transactions, arrangements. It described a system that had operated in plain sight precisely because the people inside it had no alternative, and the people who might have regulated it hadn't been looking. Silas Crow was not arrested. The document was a regulatory finding, not a criminal indictment, and the distinction mattered in ways that Mara had to sit with for a while before she could be honest about how she felt about it. There was no handcuff moment, no public reckoning, no single scene where he was made to account for himself in front of the people he'd pressured for a decade. The division ordered the dissolution of the exclusive contracting structure. They imposed financial penalties. They mandated repayment to farmers who could demonstrate losses tied to documented price manipulation, a process that Gerald Flint's office helped coordinate, which meant that the cooperative credit structure Mara had built to save Walt Kuerber's farm ended up also being the vehicle through which a number of local farmers received money they were owed. The justice of it was administrative and slow and incomplete in the way that real accountability usually is. It didn't feel like the ending a story was supposed to have. It felt more like what endings actually feel like. Not a door closing, but a pressure releasing. Not a victory, but a shift in what was possible. She talked about this with Ruth on a June evening, sitting on Mara's porch with the warm air moving in off the mountains and the main street of Ash Hollow, visible at the end of the block, quieter than it used to be in some ways, more itself in others. "I expected to feel more," Mara said. Ruth considered this. More what? "I don't know. Satisfaction, maybe. Like something was finished." "Maybe it's not finished," Ruth said. "Maybe that's the thing. You don't get to have a finished. You just get to have a different." Mara thought about that. That's either very wise or very disappointing. "Why can't it be both?" Ruth said. Silas Crow's warehouse operation contracted through the summer and into the fall. The exclusive contracts that had been the backbone of his network were voided by the division's order, and without them the freight arrangements that depended on volume fell apart, and without those the warehouse itself became an overhead he couldn't sustain on the business that remained. He didn't leave Ash Hollow. She'd half expected him to, imagined him simply departing the way men like him sometimes did when the ground shifted, going somewhere else, and starting the same thing over with different people who didn't know yet. But he didn't. He scaled back. He ran a reduced operation, legitimately, within the lines that the division's order drew around him. She saw him occasionally on the street. He did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. And that was the whole of it. She'd wanted, at various points in the past year and a half, for the confrontation with Silas to produce something dramatic. An acknowledgement, a moment of recognition, something that would let her close that particular chapter cleanly. It didn't produce any of those things. He was just a man she passed on the street in a town they both lived in, and what had happened between them was in the past tense now, and the past tense was where it was going to stay. That was its own kind of resolution, even if it wasn't the kind that felt finished. What did feel finished, or rather what felt arrived, was Stormgold. By the end of the summer, Stormgold Preserves had standing orders with the Beaumont Hotel in Denver, the Flint Mercantile in Copper Ridge, Wyoming, 4 additional specialty retailers in Colorado and Wyoming that Ellsworth Vance had referred through his own purchasing network, and a regional distributor based in Cheyenne who'd approached Mara in July after reading a mention of Stormgold in a Denver newspaper column about specialty food products coming out of the mountain territories. The newspaper column was 2 paragraphs long and described Stormgold's flavor in terms that made Mara read it twice to confirm it was actually about her preserve and not something else. The writer called it Preserves with a Sense of Place and said the Stormgold label, Eli's lopsided peach with the honest bruise, was as straightforward and undecorative as the product itself, which is to say it earns exactly the attention it asks for. She cut the column out and put it in the drawer with her important papers. Eli found it there 2 weeks later and read it without commenting. He just put it back and closed the drawer. But she noticed in the days that followed that he'd started drawing again. Not labels, but actual drawings, on whatever paper was available, filling margins of ledger pages and the backs of envelopes with small, careful sketches of things he saw. Trees, tools, the outline of the mountains from the kitchen window. She didn't say anything about it. Some things you watched from a distance and let be what they were. The summer production pushed Storm Gold to volumes she'd considered theoretical when she'd written them down in February. They'd outgrown her kitchen in the most practical and literal sense. The operation needed more cooking capacity than one wood stove and one kitchen could provide. And the question of what to do about that had been hanging over everything since May without a clean answer. The answer arrived, as answers sometimes did, sideways. Hester Crane came to her in July with a proposal. Not a casual suggestion over coffee, an actual written proposal, which told Mara that Hester had been thinking about this for a while and had decided that the only way to say it seriously was to write it down first. The proposal was for a shared production facility. A building. Hester had already identified one. A former feed store on the east end of town that had been empty for 2 years, that could house the canning operation properly, with multiple cooking stations, adequate storage, and enough working space that they weren't operating in constant physical negotiation with each other. The financing would come from the Copper Ridge Cooperative, with the building owned collectively by the core group, Mara, Hester, Ruth, the Garveys, and the Vaseks. Hester had run the numbers herself, in handwriting that was neater than Mara had expected, with columns that added up correctly. Mara read the proposal at the kitchen table with Eli reading it over her shoulder, which she'd stopped bothering to discourage months ago. "She's right about the building," Eli said. "We've been needing more space since the Beaumont doubled the order." "I know." "The collective ownership structure makes sense too, distributes the risk." "I know." "Are you going to tell her yes?" Mara set the proposal down. She looked around the kitchen that had been the whole of Storm Gold for 10 months. The wood stove, the shelves, the canning equipment crowded into every available space. The smell that had become so much a part of the house that she didn't notice it anymore except when she'd been away and came back and it hit her fresh, like a memory she lived inside of. This kitchen was where it had started, where she'd stood at midnight with a wooden spoon and a half-remembered recipe and something that tasted like stubbornness and the specific sweetness of not giving up. Leaving it was going to feel like something. "Yes," she said. "Tell her yes." The feed store on the east end of town became the Storm Gold production facility by September, which was fast enough that it required a level of coordinated effort from every person involved that tested the community's ability to actually do what it had been theoretically committed to doing. There were arguments about layout, about equipment purchases, about scheduling, about whose way of doing things was correct when 3 people with strong opinions about canning all had different strong opinions. Ruth and Hester had a disagreement in the second week of renovation that was sharp enough that they didn't speak to each other for 4 days, which created a specific tension in the working group that everyone pretended not to notice, and everyone noticed. Mara stayed out of it. She'd learned something in the past year about which problems you could solve and which problems needed to solve themselves, and Ruth and Hester's disagreement was the second kind. On the 5th day, they arrived at the building at the same time, and Ruth said something quiet that Mara didn't hear, and Hester said something back. And by the time Mara got there, they were measuring the kitchen wall together and arguing about the same things they'd been arguing about before, but without the coldness underneath it. "What did you say to her?" Mara asked Ruth later. "I said I was wrong about the shelf placement," Ruth said, "because I was." "That's it?" "Sometimes that's all it takes." Ruth picked up a hammer. "You want to help with these shelves? Or are you going to stand there being impressed by my character development?" The facility opened in October, just as the fall production push began. The first day of full operation, 5 people working simultaneously at 3 cooking stations, Eli coordinating the supply side from a proper desk in what had been the feed store's office, the smell of Storm Gold filling a space large enough that it didn't feel crowded for the first time in a year, was one of those days that didn't announce itself as significant while it was happening. It just felt like work. It felt like the ordinary work of continuing to do something that had been worth starting. Mara stood in the middle of it for a moment in the mid-morning, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the space and looking at what it was. Petra Vasek was at the nearest cooking station, managing 2 batches with the focused precision that had made her indispensable. Ruth was organizing the labeling station with the systematic efficiency that made Mara grateful every single day. Hester was talking to the supplier who'd come in with the morning delivery. her voice carrying the easy confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking at and what it was worth. Through the office window, she could see Eli bent over his desk, writing in the ledger or drafting correspondence or doing some calculation that would matter later. She couldn't tell which from here, and it didn't matter because all of it mattered. She thought, this is what I was trying to get to. Not this building specifically. This. The this she meant was harder to name than a building. It was the specific feeling of a group of people doing work together without fear underneath it, without the constant calculation of who you were indebted to and whether the person buying your labor or your fruit or your time was going to use that debt against you, without the anxiety of being alone in something that required more than one person. She had not solved loneliness with a business. She knew that. The loneliness that had settled into her after Daniel died was its own thing, separate from success or failure, and it had not entirely lifted. There were still evenings when the house was too quiet and the quiet had a particular weight to it. There were still moments when she reached for something to tell him, something funny that had happened, something she'd figured out, something she just wanted someone who'd known her for a long time to know, and arrived at the absence where that person should have been. You didn't solve that. You carried it, and you kept moving, and eventually the moving became the thing rather than the grief, without the grief ever quite going away. That was as honest as she could be about it. What had changed was everything around the grief. The shape of the days, the fact of other people in them, the way Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway in the morning with his ledger already open, already working, already thoroughly 13 and then thoroughly 14, and growing into someone she couldn't quite see the full outline of yet because he was still becoming it. The way Ruth knocked on the production facility door every morning at 7:15 precisely, as though punctuality were a form of loyalty, which for Ruth it was. The way Hester Crane had stopped looking at the ground. These were the things that had changed. They weren't nothing. They were, in fact, everything that could actually be changed. The second summer's peach harvest came in without a hailstorm. The absence of disaster felt almost strange. She caught herself checking the sky more than she needed to, the way you watch for something after it's happened to you once. But the summer was ordinary, and the harvest was good, and the Denton orchard produced fruit that Ben brought to the facility himself on a Tuesday morning with a quiet pride in his face that he didn't make into a speech. "Good crop," she said, looking at the crates. "Better than before the storm in some ways," he said. "I mean that." She looked at him. "I know you do." Walt Korber came in with his first direct delivery 2 weeks later, stone fruit from the eastern edge of his acreage that he'd been experimenting with, a variety slightly different from the standard peach that had a firmer flesh and a flavor that ran sharper at the edges. He was uncertain about it, which was how she knew he cared about it. "I don't know if it's right for your recipe," he said. She took one from the crate, cut it with the knife she carried in her apron pocket now. She'd started doing this somewhere around the 3rd month and never stopped, and tasted it standing there in the delivery bay. It was different. It was sharper and more complicated and would require adjusting the sugar ratio and possibly reconsidering the spice balance she'd had settled for a year. "It's not right for the current recipe," she said. His face moved towards something careful and controlled. "It's right for a new one," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not into anything you could point to and name, just a small relaxation of something that had been held tense for a long time. "I've got another variety I've been growing on the north side," he said. "Different again. I wasn't going to mention it." "Mention it," she said. Gerald Flint came back to Ash Hollow in August, not for a credit review or a debt restructuring, but because Agnes had written to say she was visiting her brother and she wanted to come see the operation she'd been hearing about since the first jar arrived in Copper Ridge 18 months ago. Agnes Flint, in person, was exactly what her letters had suggested she would be. A woman in her 60s with the slanted handwriting and the direct opinions and the particular practicality of someone who had run a business in a small town for 20 years without anyone making it easy for her. She walked through the production facility with the assessing eye of a merchant and said very little until she'd seen everything. And then she sat down at the table in the office where Eli did his accounts and said, "You're underselling the Wyoming market." Mara sat across from her. "In what sense?" "In the sense that what people out there want from specialty food is not just quality, it's the story. Agnes set her hands on the table. Every jar you send me sells partly because of what's in it, and partly because my customers know where it came from and what it took to make it. That's worth more than you're charging for it. I price for the market, Mara said. Price for the story, Agnes said. They're different markets. Mara looked at Gerald, who was sitting in the corner with the particular expression of a man watching his sister do exactly what she always did, which was identify the correct answer before anyone else had finished asking the question. She's right, he said, for the record. She usually is, Mara said. That must be irritating to grow up with. Agnes looked at her sharply, and then, for the first time, because Agnes Flint was not a woman who laughed easily, she laughed. It was brief and genuine, and it changed the whole register of the room. Eli raised his prices in Wyoming by 12% the following month. Agnes's reorder came in 3 weeks later at the new price without comment. The formal Commerce Division ruling came through in September. Not the preliminary findings from April, but the full, final determination, with the penalty structure and the remediation requirements and the specific orders regarding Silas Crow's trading operation. The remediation payments to affected farmers were processed through Gerald Flint's cooperative over the following 3 months. They weren't large. The amounts per farmer were modest when divided across 11 years of documented losses. But they were real, and real mattered in ways that large didn't always. Ben Denton used his remediation payment to repair the irrigation system on the east side of his orchard that he'd been patching for 3 years because he couldn't afford to fix it properly. The Vaseks bought a piece of equipment they'd been pricing for 2 years. Walt Korber paid down the remainder of his cooperative loan ahead of schedule, which Gerald Flint reported to Mara with the quiet satisfaction of a man who liked it when arithmetic resolved cleanly. Mara used her own portion. The formal finding had included a remediation component for lost business resulting from the freight route manipulation she'd documented, to install a second cooking system at the facility and hire 2 more people part-time, which took the Storm Gold operation to 8 regular workers and changed the daily texture of the place in ways that were still settling when winter came. The hiring was harder than she'd expected, not technically, but humanly. Adding people to something that had been built by a specific group of people who'd been through something specific together was complicated. The 2 new hires, a woman named Dorothea who'd been farming widowed land on her own for 3 years, and a young man from the Vasek family's extended community who'd been doing day labor since he arrived in Montana, were good workers and honest people. And still it took months before the facility felt like itself again rather than like itself plus 2 people who weren't quite yet part of the thing. Mara thought about this often in that period, about what it took to add people to something you'd built in crisis. Built specifically because you needed each other, built in the particular intensity of a situation where everyone was risking something and everyone knew it. The bonds that formed in that intensity were real, but they were also specific, and you couldn't replicate them by hiring someone after the crisis was over. You had to build something new with the new people, which was slower and less dramatic and required patience that the original crisis hadn't demanded, because the original crisis had demanded urgency instead. She talked about it with Eli one evening in October, when they were the last 2 at the facility after everyone else had gone home, doing the end-of-day accounting that Eli still insisted on completing in person rather than leaving for the next morning. "It's weird," he said, without looking up from the ledger. "Dorothea asked me today how the operation started. I told her about the hailstorm and the $3 and all of it. She said it sounded like something out of a book." "What did you say?" "I said it mostly felt like a lot of early mornings and a wood stove that didn't always cooperate." He turned a page. She laughed. "I think it helped." Mara looked at him. He was 14 now, almost 15, and the boyhood was still there, but it was wearing thinner, the way boyhood does, revealing something underneath that was going to be a different kind of person entirely. Not better, not worse, just different. The person he was becoming, rather than the person he'd been when he showed up on her porch with his too large coat and his careful, survival-trained attention and his offer to learn whatever was worth learning. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "What do you want?" she asked. "I mean, not for the business, for you. What do you actually want?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone encountering a question they've been thinking about without quite letting themselves think about it. "I want to understand how things work," he said slowly. "Not just the accounts, the whole thing. How you build something, how you make it last, how you get people to work together on it." He paused. "I think I want to go to school for it, properly, if that's something that's possible." She held his look steady. "It's possible." "We can't—" "It's possible," she said again, more firmly. "We'll figure out the how. That's what we do." He looked back at his ledger, but his face had changed slightly in the way faces change when something shifts from theoretical to real. She didn't say anything else about it that evening, but she started a separate column in the accounts after he'd gone home. A column she didn't label yet. That was just a number she added to every month, small at first, and then less small as the business grew. A column with a purpose she intended to make possible when the number was ready. Some things you didn't announce. You just did them. The October harvest came in fully, and with it the particular busy intensity of fall production that Mara now recognized as a rhythm rather than a crisis. The facility ran at capacity for 6 weeks. The Beaumont standing order had tripled from the original 240 jars. Agnes Flint had expanded into a second location in Wyoming and was asking about Colorado. The regional distributor in Cheyenne was discussing a formal 3-year arrangement. Storm Gold Preserves was, by any honest measure, a real business, not a big one. Not the kind of business that anyone would write about in terms of financial scale, not the kind that changed the economy of a territory, but the kind that was genuinely there, genuinely solid, genuinely built on something that wasn't fear or manipulation or the exploitation of people who had no alternative. The kind that had made something true about a place and a group of people and what was possible when those people decided to do something differently than it had been done before. On the last Saturday of October, Mara did something she hadn't planned to do and hadn't considered doing until the morning of the day she did it. She walked to the cemetery on the edge of town. She hadn't been since the previous fall, which she didn't feel good about, though guilt was a currency she'd largely stopped spending on the past. She stood in front of Daniel's stone. Simple granite, his name and the years, nothing else because she hadn't been able to settle on words at the time and hadn't gone back to add any. And she stood there for a while in the October cold without saying anything, because she wasn't the kind of person who talked to stones. What she did was think about him, specifically and concretely, not in the gauzy way grief sometimes made you think about people. She thought about the specific things he'd said and done and been. His particular laugh, the way he read by leaning too close to the lamp. His opinion on everything, which was always strong and frequently wrong and always willing to be revised when you made a good enough argument. The way he'd believed in her competence before she'd fully believed in it herself, which was a gift she hadn't thanked him for enough when he was there to thank. She stood there long enough that her feet got cold, which brought her back to the practical world that continued to exist regardless of grief's preference for suspension. She said quietly, to the stone, and to no one, and to herself, "I'm all right. We're all right." Then she walked back to town. The winter that followed was the mildest Ash Hollow had seen in several years, which people took as a good sign or simply accepted as weather depending on their disposition. The facility ran through the winter on stored fruit and the preserving work that didn't require fresh harvest. Apple butter, a plum preserve that Ruth had developed over the summer, and that Ellsworth Vance had requested for the Beaumont spring menu, a small batch of something experimental with dried stone fruit that Mara and Walt had been working on since August and hadn't gotten right yet and kept trying to get right. Eli started correspondence courses through a commercial college in Denver in January, which he did in the evenings after the facility closed, at the desk in the office where he did the accounts. He didn't make a production of it. He just started doing it, the same way he'd started doing everything, with the specific quiet commitment of someone who had decided a thing was worth doing and was going to do it regardless of whether it was convenient. Mara found him asleep at the desk one night in February, coursework spread around him, his face on his arms, completely unconscious in the way that only the very young can be unconscious. Total, immediate, without the complicated quality of adult sleep. She put a blanket over his shoulders and turned down the lamp and went home in the cold February dark, thinking about how you couldn't plan for the people who would walk into your life and become essential to it. You could only be paying attention when they arrived, She had been paying attention. That was perhaps the most accurate thing she could say about herself, that she had been paying attention when it mattered and had tried to act on what she saw rather than on what was safer or easier to see. The peach trees bloomed in May for the second time since the hailstorm, and this year the bloom was fuller. Not perfect. There were still sections of the Denton orchard that were thinner than before, still evidence of what the storm had done to the structure of things. But fuller. The damage incorporated into the growth rather than replaced by it, which was not the same as healed, but was its own kind of becoming. Mara stood in the orchard on a May morning with her hands in her pockets, looking at the bloom, and she felt something that was close to peace, without being quite peace. Something that didn't have a clean name, but felt like the difference between surviving something and being, genuinely, on the other side of it. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what she'd learned. Not for a speech, not for a column in a newspaper, just if someone asked honestly what the last 2 years had taught her. She thought she would say this: broken things are not finished things. She'd known that about the peaches, instinctively, the morning she'd spent her last $3 on fruit that everyone else had written off. She'd known it the way you know things before you have the language for them. What she hadn't known was how completely that was true of everything, of people, of communities, of the small economies that hold towns together, of herself. She would say, the hardest thing she'd done was not fight Silas Crow. The hardest thing was ask for help. Every instinct she had argued against it. The instinct that said needing people made you vulnerable. That vulnerability was dangerous. That the only safe position was the one where you owed nothing to anyone and no one owed anything to you. That instinct had kept her upright through Daniel's death and the 2 years after it. And it was wrong. Not wrong to be independent, not wrong to be strong, but wrong to believe that strength and needing people were opposites. The moment she'd sat at Ruth Hadley's table and laid the whole thing out plainly, the numbers, the gap, what she needed, was the moment the business actually became possible. Not because Ruth solved the problem, but because asking opened the door to the community of people who could solve it together. She would say, fairness is not weakness. She'd priced her preserve at what it was worth. She'd paid her suppliers what their fruit was worth. She'd kept her accounts honestly and her agreements in writing and her word consistent with her actions. Silas had treated fairness as naivety, as the thing people practiced when they didn't know better. And for a long time in Ash Hollow, that had seemed correct because he was the one with the power, and the power appeared to prove the point. But power built on other people's fear was not the same thing as power built on other people's trust, and the difference between them showed up eventually, the way structural things always show up. Not until you put weight on them and see what holds. She would say, the hardest part of being the person who does the thing is that you have to keep doing it after the crisis is over. The crisis made it clear. It made every decision obvious because the alternative to every decision was losing everything, and losing everything is a clarifying condition. What came after was harder in its own way because the ordinary days didn't have that clarity. The ordinary days just needed you to keep showing up, keep doing the work, keep paying attention, keep being honest about what you saw, even when what you saw was complicated or slow or incomplete. She was still learning how to be a person in the ordinary days. She thought she would probably be learning it for a long time. A sound at the edge of the orchard made her turn. Eli was walking toward her with 2 cups of coffee, which meant he'd come from the facility and had seen her in the orchard from the road and had made a detour, which was the kind of thing he did without being asked and without making it into a thing. He handed her a cup. They stood together in the May orchard looking at the bloom. "How's the Cheyenne contract looking?" she asked. "Good. Finalized by next week if the language on the delivery schedule holds." He drank his coffee. "Gerald Flint wants to talk about the Wyoming expansion again. Agnes has a 3rd location she's considering." "Set up the call?" "Already did. Thursday afternoon." She nodded. She looked at the trees. He stood beside her and didn't fill the silence with anything because he'd learned, or maybe had always known, in the particular way that certain people know things early, that some silences were doing their own work and didn't need assistance. The bloom was uneven and it was real, and it was going to produce fruit that had been through something and came back anyway. And Mara Ellison was going to turn that fruit into something worth keeping, The way she had been turning difficult things into something worth keeping since the morning she'd crouched in the mud on a market street with her neighbors watching and come back up with her $3 in her hand and her back straight and her eyes clear, and the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet, waiting in the part of her that refused, against all evidence, against all logic, against all the comfortable mathematics of knowing when to give up, to believe that what was broken was therefore finished. It wasn't finished. It was, it turned out, just starting. The coffee was hot, and the morning was cold, and the orchard was blooming around them. And in the facility on the east end of Ash Hollow, the wood stove was already burning, and the day's work was already beginning. And that was enough, more than enough, for now.